Yo, what's going on guys? Welcome back to the channel. It's Bertrude and today we're using my Antman build. This is a poison based build. Let's take a look at the stats. Pretty simple stuff. It's a level 30 build with 35 vigor, 18 strength and 22 dex. We're using the dex and the strength knots to boost our dexterity and our strength by 10, which allows us to use a shield on our build. And then here's a quick look at the armour and talismans. The first step in Invasions with this build is to drink our flask, which gives us 10 extra strength, giving us the boost we need to use our Ant Skull Plate Shield. We've then got two main weapons on the build, the first one being the Serpent Bone Blade. We've then also got a poison infused Shamshir, and that's got the Poisonous Mist on it. And then in our second weapon slot we'll always have the Venomous Fangs, and they're equipped with Endure. And that's the build guys. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you like the content. It's time for you lot to sit back, relax, get your feet up, get yourselves a cup of tea and enjoy the video. This is Antonio. To put it simply, Antonio is a very, very strange man. Antonio thinks he's an ant. Antonio's had an obsession with ants that can't be matched. It shaped his life and turned him into this absolute little weirdo you see before you here today. Antonio discovered his obsession at an early age. He wouldn't play outside with cars and toys. He'd walk around in the woods looking for ant hills. He'd walk around for hours sometimes, well into the hours of darkness, something that infuriated his worried mother, who knew all too well that the lands between weren't a safe place after dark. "Why can't you play with all the other children?" she'd say. "Why don't you have any friends, Antonio? Why are you such a freaky little weirdo? Why are you out in the woods on your own? Why can't you play with all the other children?" Antonio would look back at her in absolute disbelief. He just couldn't understand. "The ants," he would say, "they're just so beautiful." His mother brushed it off. Maybe it's just a phase. She had seen some other children running around with strange haircuts, all kinds of different colours. Some of them wore baggy clothes. She knew kids would express themselves in all kinds of funny ways. Surely it's a phase. He's going to grow out of it. There was one night that followed soon after, however, that made her think maybe this is more than just a phase. You see, on one of Antonio's nights in the woods, he did in fact find an anthill, and he couldn't control his excitement. It was huge, the biggest one he'd ever seen, and he did in fact feel a tingle in his loins. A tingle that he would come to crave more and more in his coming years. Antonio dropped to his knees and fell forward. He embraced the anthill into his bosom. He pressed his face into the cold dirt, and he felt a feeling flow through him that he had never felt before. He felt that he was where he belongs. He felt at peace, and the tingle that he had felt in his loins now moved up into his whole body, and the feeling of ecstasy was almost too much to control. Hours later, Antonio's mother heard him return home. It was late, but she was a couple of bottles of wine deep into her night, and she didn't want to have her evening spoiled by delving into the mind of her strange little offspring. It was an hour later when she woke in her chair. She had drifted off. It was time for bed. As she walked past Antonio's room, she noticed some dirt in the hall. Too much dirt than is reasonable. Antonio's door was ajar, and there was a light shining from the lamp at the side of his bed. She could hear a strange groaning coming from the room. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she pushed the door open to peer inside. The dirt that was in the hall was all over Antonio's floor, and there was a trail that led over to his bed. What she saw next terrified her. Antonio was laid out on his bed, naked minus the shorts that he liked to sleep in, and crawling all over him, all over his body, all over the floor, all over his bed. There were thousands of ants. His body was covered in bites. Each one of them glowed an angry shade of red. Antonio groaned in a way that would indicate someone having a devilish fever. He was pale and he had a layer of sweat across his whole body, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. His mother approached, unable to believe what she was witnessing. "Antonio, what have you done?" He gazed back at her. His eyes were aglaze, and he had a smile across his face that terrified his mother more than anything she had ever experienced. Antonio spoke. The ants. Beautiful. They love me. I love them. He grabbed his mother's hand. I love them. Antonio passed out. The rest of Antonio's childhood years were difficult for all concerned. He didn't make any friends, and his obsession continued. His mother became more and more distant from her son. What was this little monster she had created? She found comfort in the bottle, and she drank more and more to help pass the days she spent worrying about her boy. It was well into his adult life when Antonio did indeed find another person that he felt a connection to. A young lady who he happened to meet when he was out on one of his walks in the woods. You see, he had become quite the hunter of anthills. He felt he could sense the ants all around him. He wandered out in the darkness and he closed his eyes. He felt he could hear the little scurry of tiny ant feet. The ants called to him. They would lead him to their homes, and when found, Antonio would do things. Unspeakable things. Things that were completely normal in Antonio's warped mind, but to an outsider it would be enough to turn your stomach. But on one of these walks, Antonio bumped into another insect enthusiast. She was named Beth, and in an awkward exchange of information, Antonio found that there was someone else who seemed to have a similar obsession as he did. Beth loved nature. She was completely enthralled with understanding the nature of things. She had a beautiful mind, but from a social standpoint she was very similar to Antonio. Socially awkward, introverted, low self-esteem, and for the two to meet out in the woods, both pursuing the thing that to others seemed so strange, it was like finding a needle in a haystack. She gathered from their brief conversation that Antonio had a keen interest in insects, and she shared her love for nature and indeed insects, and for a while it was enough to calm Antonio's unhealthy obsession. He never told her of his darkest desires. He didn't share the extent of his thoughts. He kept those to himself. They were not for her. But for now he felt a connection to something else in this world, something else besides his ants. For a while life was good for the pair. Having found a kindred spirit, they were both no longer alone in the world, and for a moment Antonio was at peace. He had moved into Beth's small corner of the lands between, which was in a perfect location, being surrounded by trees and nature, very close indeed to a large woodland forest. Life was good. However, as was said, this was just for a little while. Antonio's obsessions soon started to pull on his soul. He started to hear the ants calling to him. They longed for his presence as he longed for theirs. Beth had been feeling that Antonio had been growing a bit distant, and she finally plucked up the courage to confront Antonio as to why things were feeling so strange between the two. Antonio couldn't hold it any longer. He spilled everything to her. He told her his deepest, darkest fantasies. He told her of his obsession and his longing to be at one with the ants. It's all he wanted. The presence of another human, it seemed, wasn't enough to satisfy Antonio's cravings. The next few months were awkward to say the least. Beth had put the deranged admission down to stress or maybe a fever that her Antonio had been suffering from. It was too much to believe that the things he had told her had come from someone of sound mind. He was clearly under some kind of strain, or maybe it's lack of sleep, she told herself. Things will return to normal soon. It's a phase, she would think, just a phase. It will pass. Sound familiar, right? It was a few months even after this that things finally took their final plunge into complete insanity. Beth had been out for the day, wandering through the wilderness, contemplating what had become of her life with this man that had changed into someone she barely even recognised anymore. His levels of obsession had reached an all-time high. She had begun to see more and more ants crawling around her house. She couldn't get any sense out of Antonio on the matter, and what little mumblings he did speak told of strange conversations he had had with the ants. "They see you," he would say. "They see you, Beth. They know. They see you. They told me." Ramblings of a lunatic. Beth had finally come to the conclusion that she had to break away. She had took a walk to clear her head, and on the return she was going to end this madness. Antonio had to go. Beth returned home to find a sight that she would never, ever forget. Antonio was stood in front of the mirror, covered in dirty, bloody bandages. You see, he had been absent for the last few days. Beth had seen no sight of him, but now he had returned, and as he stood in front of the mirror, blood dripping at his feet, He slowly began to unravel the bandages from his head, arms, hands and legs, and he unveiled the new form that stood before her. What had he done? His face was black and blue, covered in bruises and dried blood, but she could see his features were swollen and unnatural looking. His eyes were now large, much larger than a normal human being's eyes should be, and the colour. They were a piercing green. They had an alien look to them. He no longer had fingers. Instead, there seemed to be some giant stone-like mound that had a large, curved, claw-like stinger extruding from them. Antonio lifted his claws to his face and he stared into them with his expressionless green orbs that were now his eyes. She noticed a peculiar smile arise from the corner of his mouth, and she could see that Antonio no longer had teeth. Instead, there were sharp fangs where his teeth should have been. There was also a strange texture engraved into his skin, on his arms and legs. Beth couldn't fully make it out, but it no longer looked like human skin. There was a scaly texture to it. It looked extremely painful. This was all too much to take in. The thing that stood before her was no longer Antonio. This was something different. Antonio, what have you done to yourself? He glanced towards her. No, not Antonio, he said. Just Ant. This is me, Beth. This is what I am. This is how I am meant to be. I am beautiful. I can be with them now. With my own kind. He glanced back into the mirror and then fell down on his hands to crouch low to the floor. He let out the most bizarre scream Beth had ever heard, and he scurried past her out the door. Beth ran after him, only to see him disappear into the woods behind her house. She never saw him again. Antonio the Ant, a true tale of unhealthy obsession right there. I've always absolutely loved this build. This is one of my favourite character builds that I've ever made. It's always been a funny little character, and I've made videos on this build before, and I've always joked about how much of a freaky little weirdo he is. He loves ants. He's got a proper obsession with ants. You often see him down in the caves, you know, just admiring all those giant ants, and he often gets himself into trouble for it. And, you know, he just thinks he's an ant. He's a right little weirdo. And I've always joked about it, but this time around, I've been doing these little lore stories lately for some of my videos, and I thought this build, Antonio the Ant, is a perfect one to do another little story for. So that was his tale of pure obsession that eventually led into some kind of plastic surgery nightmare where he's actually tried to change himself into an ant, which in his own mind is perfectly normal, and then he runs off to go and try and live with his own kind out in the woods, or maybe even down into the darkness in the caves underneath the lands between. It's just a really funny little idea with a nice, you know, bit of a dark twist on it, which is a running theme throughout my videos, but it's a real fun one. Love this build, love writing the story for it, and I hope you guys have enjoyed. This is the last invasion for the video. I'm going to let this one play out, but look after yourselves guys, look after each other. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you all next time.